Following the Nuremberg trials, there were 7 former members of the Third Reich's government who were taken to Spandau Prison. They were left there to serve out their varying prison sentences that they had been given, and so that justice could be carried out for their roles in the regime that began the Second World War in Europe. Amongst them was Rudolf Hess, the Deputy Führer, who was given a life sentence, and who would literally never be released as he died behind the huge prison walls of Spandau. Some of the prisoners completed their sentences, such as Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, as did Hitler Youth leader Baldur von Schirach. But eventually, only Hess was left within the prison. Following his death, the site was actually demolished and torn down to prevent it becoming a shrine and to ensure that any material from the prison never fell into sympathetic hands. The materials and bricks were ground into powder, which was either buried at a former RAF base or was dumped in the North Sea. But what is not very well known about is what life was actually like for those Nazi prisoners within Spandau. What did they do each day? What were they allowed to do? Could they have visitors? In this video, we look at the life of the last Nazis inside of Spandau, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Spandau Prison was a site which was designed to hold hundreds of inmates, but following the Nuremberg trials, there were only 7 men incarcerated there. Each prisoner was given a number, and they were referred to by this. Baldur von Schirach, the Hitler Youth leader, was number 1, Admiral and Reich President Karl Dönitz 2, Foreign Minister Konstantin von Neurath number 3, Admiral Erich Raeder was 4, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, was 5, Walter Funk, President of the Reich Bank, 6, and Rudolf Hess, the Deputy Führer, being prisoner 7. The 4 occupying powers inside of Berlin, the French, British, Soviets and Americans, all operated the prison on a rota which changed each month. So different authorities had possession of the prison for 3 months every year, and the rules and regulations for the inmates depended on who was in charge at the time. It was known, for example, that the Soviet Guard force were by far the harshest. The old brick prison was enclosed by one wall, which was 15 metres high, and there was another wall around 9 metres high, and then another which was topped with electrified wire. There was no chance of escape, neither would the prisoners have wanted to. Many were incredibly well known, and they were also getting older, making escape virtually impossible. There were also around 60 guards on duty at all times, and there were machine guns in the guard towers, and these were staffed 24 hours a day. Because there were only 7 prisoners in a place of hundreds, the inmates were spaced out to prevent them communicating between each other in Morse code or even just trying to talk. The individual prison cells were around 3 metres long and were around 4 metres high, being less than 3 metres wide. Every minute of the day was to be used in conjunction with the strict prison routine. The prisoners' outgoing letters to family members were limited to 1 page a month, and they were checked, and they were not allowed to talk to each other. Newspapers were also banned. They were not allowed to write diaries or memoirs, and visits by family members were limited to just 15 minutes every 2 months. Lights were also flashed into the prison cells every 15 minutes to ensure they had not taken their own lives. These strict regulations and rules were later, as the years rolled on, slightly relaxed, and there were some who were opposed to the strictness. The Soviet Union insisted on a very tough approach, and this was driven by the fact that the men locked up in Spandau had represented a government of which led to up to 90 million civilian deaths in the Soviet Union, and they were not willing to compromise on the treatment of the Nuremberg Nazis at all. The Americans, the British and French were in favour of relaxing their incarceration, but the Soviets would not allow it, and this was a time in which a Cold War was gripping Europe, and hesitancy was used when negotiating with the Soviets. But what happened every single day? Well, the prisoners woke up at 6 a.m, and they were ordered to wash, then clean their cells, and they then gathered in the corridor. They then went to breakfast, and they remained in the garden of the prison if the weather was nice, until around lunchtime. They then had their lunch, and were given a post-lunch rest in their cells, before they were taken back out into the garden. Dinner took place at 5 p.m, and the inmates went back into their cells before lights out at 10 p.m. The prisoners were given a shave and a haircut if they needed to on certain days, and they also did their own laundry every Monday. They were also allowed to visit some other facilities in the prison, such as the libraries, and they were given roles and responsibilities. But there was some undercover communication going on from within the prison to the outside. Some of the guards who oversaw their incarceration were sympathetic to their plight, and what they saw was the Spandau Seven, a group of old men who were being held in very tough conditions. Because of this, some prisoners gave the guards pieces of paper to be smuggled out of the prison to the outside, and Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, even smuggled out huge writings which later formed his best-selling autobiography, Inside the Third Reich. Speer later wrote in his secret diaries that, September 11th, 1949, another 6 weeks have passed, 1 month after another. Somewhere I have read that boredom is the one torment of hell that Dante forgot. So he referred to the prison as hell based upon the boredom he experienced. Also, through these illicit lines and through the guards, Walter Funk managed to obtain a constant supply of cognac, with alcohol actually being banned in the prison, but he openly shared this with some of the other prisoners on social occasions and possibly even the guards. Between the Spandau Seven, there was infighting and rivalry, almost in the same manner that had been taking place during World War II within the inner circle of Hitler's government. There were different groups. Hess and Speer kept themselves to themselves, and the other 5 didn't like them. Erich Raeder and Karl Dönitz were referred to as the Admiralty, and they stuck together, despite the fact, personally, they didn't really get on. Balder von Schirach and Walter Funk were said to have been inseparable and very good friends, with Konstantin von Neurath being friendly to everyone. But one problem existed within the prison still, and that was that the men remained relatively devoted to the Nazi Party and to Hitler, and they maintained their feelings about each other, which emerged during the war. Arguments regularly broke out, and prisoners would be sent back to their rooms. Albert Speer tried his best to keep physically fit and mentally fit, and he engaged in daily walks around the prison's gardens, and he also created an elaborate prison garden with flower beds, fruit trees and lawns. He tried to imagine a trip around the world on his walks, beginning from Berlin, heading east across Eurasia, and then travelling to North America. He measured the distance he walked each day, and he believed that by the end of his sentence he'd walked around 30,000 kilometres and had finished his sentence walking from Berlin to somewhere around Mexico. He also claimed to have read 5,000 books whilst locked up. Erich Raeder, the former admiral, was known as the librarian of Spandau, and Dönitz was his assistant, and they created their own insignia for these jobs, and they must have been very bored. Rudolf Hess, though, the deputy Führer, was very different. He avoided all forms of work and thought it was below him, and he was referred to as the laziest man in Spandau. He would not pull weeds out of the garden, and he never attended prison church services. He complained constantly about his health, and thought he was being poisoned by his guards, and long into the night every night he screamed, screeched and moaned, crying out in pain. Many were suspicious of his behaviour, and Speer would sometimes tend to Hess's needs, taking some form of sympathy for the former deputy Führer. Hess would be injected with what he believed was sedatives by the prison's medical officer, but this was in fact just distilled water, and it did get him back to sleep. The prisoners referred to Hess as his imprisoned lordship, and he was mocked and did have some pranks played upon him. But Hess was very different. He refused all visitors for more than 20 years, allowing only his son Wulf and wife Ilsa to see him in 1969 after suffering with a perforated ulcer. The prison officials thought he was dying, and they then relaxed his treatment, and he was given better conditions, such as access to a water heater to make tea and coffee, and he was later allowed to walk freely inside different rooms. But for his security each night, he was moved room from room, as it was believed that he could have been broken out of the prison in some regard by groups who were growing in their sympathy for him. There were repeated calls for Hess's release, as he was the final prisoner and the rest had been released, and it was found in 1979 that he was suffering from prostate cancer. He refused treatment, but never refused to apologise about the crimes of the Nazi Party, and remained anti-Semitic and devoted to Hitler. He was found dead at the age of 93 on the 17th of August 1987 in rather strange circumstances within the reading room in the prison's garden. The death of Spandau's final prisoner marked the closing of the site, and as mentioned, it was demolished to prevent it becoming a shrine for those who had been locked up there. The conditions of the prison were relatively strict in the immediate aftermath of the Nuremberg trials, but as the decades went on, things were relaxed for the inmates, and they were allowed certain concessions. But today nothing exists of the site, except many different stories about the men who were locked up there, and there is still a significant amount of mystery regarding the demise of Spandau's final famous prisoner, and also his death. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.